Hi guys and welcome back to Is It Worth It Reviews. Today we are going to talk about topping D50 III. And this D50 series has been forgotten a little bit by topping because the latest one, D50S, was like 3 years or something like that ago. And I reviewed that one. That one was good and a very decent upgrade over the original D50 that was too sharp and too analytical. And now several years later we have D50 III. If it was SMSL, it would be D50 MK2, D50 MK3, D50 Ultra, D50 Pro, and then D50 III. But fortunately for us, topping has a bit more relaxed tempo of releasing new products. And this one, as you can see, looks exactly the same like its predecessors. It's the same chassis, same looks, same monochromatic OLED display in the front and this small joypad to control the unit. There's a remote control too, and the whole device is based around two Saber DAC chips. Those are really good one, 9039 something. I'll put that on the screen. And those chips alone are good enough to be in a flagship grade product. But as you probably know already, the DAC chip is not the whole device. There's the output stage and the quality of it, and of course power supply, and those are even more important than the chip itself. But this being a very budget-oriented product, Topping did something that they often do in this budget segment. Basically, they completely omitted thinking about the power supply. So if you look in the back, you'll see a USB-C 5 volts power connector, but there is no power supply in the box to be found. So Topping doesn't provide power supply, they'll leave that to you, like connect it to your PC or phone charger, power bank, or any 5 volts supply that you have in your house. And as with every DAC that I've ever tested, the better that power supply is, the better the final sound fidelity will be. So if you, for example, use hifi power or some sort of linear power supply, you will increase performance of this DAC. But be ready to have at least a free phone charger when you buy this DAC, because as I said, power supply is not in the box. Aside from that, we have a usual set of digital inputs, USB, then coaxial and optical. Then on the output side, we have two sets of analog outputs. RCAs are single-ended and TRS, which are balanced. They are smaller and more compact physical jacks opposed to XLRs, and Topping had to use these to fit them into this slim chassis, which is okay. And aside from usual features like choosing digital filters or selecting a slightly different output voltage between 4 and 5 volts on balanced output and 2 and 2.5 volts on single-ended outputs, most modern DACs coming from Topping and SMSL offer this, and I personally like higher voltage more usually, and it's the default one with D50 III, so I suggest just leave that as it is. But one very interesting option here is PEC, parametric equalizer, which is integrated into this DAC, and joined with software you can adjust frequency response in 10 different bands, and then you can save different profiles. I think there are 10 different profiles too. So for example, if you're using this DAC as a part of your headphone setup, and you have different headphones and you tune the frequency response to each of them differently, you can make profiles so you can quickly switch between them when you change your headphones. It's quite convenient if you like using equalizer, which some purists don't like using, but I'll allow it. But on the other hand, if you're using Bluetooth connection instead of good old wires, sir, you're a disgrace to the audiophile community. You should be ashamed of yourself, and you should immediately give all of your DACs to the first real audiophile you encounter. Moving on. How does the Topping D50 III actually sound? I started using D50 III with a cheap Walmart small 5 volts power supply that I had on hands. It's like $5 or something like that, because that is the most fair out of the box experience that doesn't increase price. And I have to say that like that, D50 III really performs well. Tonally speaking, it's a very well balanced DAC. There is nice bass, oomph and presence, and mid-range is clean and clear, and high frequencies are really well extended. So if we are speaking in terms of like just dark or bassy or too bright, spiky or sharp in any way, there is nothing of that sort happening with the sound of D50 III. It's a mostly neutral sounding DAC, like most good DACs these days. And the detail retrieval is really good, but it's not on the nose. There is a sense of calmness in the mid-range and a complete lack of any annoying sharpness. The sound staging is decent. It's not particularly wide or deep like some upmarket DACs can offer you, but it's not truly 2D and congested like some older DACs like A50, for example, would offer. This is clearly richer sounding DAC and better balanced sounding DAC. So D50 III has this newer, more mature tuning of newer, more fresh topping DAC models, like for example E32 that I quite liked. E32 might be a bit darker up top. I don't have that DAC with me anymore, but I do remember comparing it to some other DACs that I compared D50 III with too, so I use those DACs as a common reference. I think that E32 actually is slightly bassier and slightly darker up top DAC, but generally speaking, they're much more alike than they're different. And D50 III is much closer to E32 in how it sounds than to A50 and A50S. But what E32 lacks are balanced outputs. And every DAC, when connected to true balanced connection, if you have an integrated amp or a preamp that has true differential design, will sound better than using RCA connection. If it doesn't sound better at all, at least a bit more clarity and a bit more dynamic and liveliness, that probably means that somewhere in the chain you have like dummy balanced connections that are there just for convenience and not true differential design. But the most fiercest competitor on the market currently for D50 III is not coming from the topping itself, but from the SMSL. Because I think that for around $200, the best DAC to buy nowadays, these days, is SMSL D6S, and that's this one. And there are slight differences. This one is slightly bigger, so it has bigger XLR connectors, and also there is a power supply on board, so you connect this one directly to the AC outlet, which is in a way better because you don't have to think about a power supply, but in a way topping D50 III has a potential for the upgrade that D6S doesn't. And I compare these two with that cheap switching mode power supply that I mentioned because that kept their prices equal. And the performance was pretty equal too. So any difference that I noticed are more in terms of different flavoring than there is like a different quality. So for example, SMSL feels a bit more direct and engaging in the mid-range. And that's the part of the frequency spectrum with the biggest amount of details. Anything that we perceive as fine details like fingers touching strings or small sounds like leaves rustling, paper rustling, or anything like that, that is the mid-range. And SMSL D6S has more forward, slightly crisper mid-range. And if you focus on that part, it will feel like it offers slightly better resolution. On the other hand, D50 III has slightly better high-frequency extension. And that gives some sort of glossiness to your sound. So tones do sound glossier, like they're more liquid, and they have almost a radiant character to them. For some reason, they just feel more open and more liquid-like. And that's about it. We are talking about similarly capable sound staging, equally wide, similarly deep, and in general, similar level of details that are focused in slightly different aspects of the sound, in a slightly different frequency spectrum areas. And I listened to many songs and I could not choose which one I actually preferred. In some songs, for example, if I listened to Leonard Cohen or Norah Jones, I liked SMSL more because their husky and raspy vocals sounded touch more intimate and more detailed, closer to me with SMSL. On the other hand, if I listen to some live acoustic recording with guitar strings, I felt that topping created slightly better sensation of sound staging and that reverberant, long-lasting tone in space, just slightly better than SMSL. And that small flavor difference is just not something that you should be worried about. Maybe more important than that is one practical difference, and that's that power supply. You already have it with SMSL, and you don't with topping D50 III. And as you can see, D50 III is equaling SMSL with a cheap power supply that I used. But if you add a better power supply, D50 III will sound better. And let's put all of this into a slightly wider perspective. If you are, for example, on some of the older models like D50S, which is still quite a decent DAC, or D50, which is not so decent, D50 III would be a very decent upgrade with just more natural, calmer, richer sound. If you have any great DACs, great budget DACs from like last year, like topping E32 or SMSL D6S or SMSL SU1 also, it's not really as good as these two, but it's very close. We are talking about roughly the same tier, so D50 III is just another really good DAC entry into the market. But it's not some completely new and unseen value. On the other hand, if you look to some pricier DACs, you would have to pay at least twice or more the price to notice any meaningful upgrade in the sound fidelity. So, for example, we are talking about SMSL SU9 Pro and Ultra, or Geshelli Labs J2S, or topping D70 Pro. So that tier of DACs actually sound a bit richer and a bit better than this one, but at a noticeably higher price. Anything in between, anything that you might look at and see like, oh, this is $299 or $3 or $350, like topping E70, it will not actually be better than this one. It will just be different in terms of flavoring. And I don't have E70 with me anymore, but there's a good chance that D50 III armed with something like hifi iPower X would actually slightly surpass E70 in terms of sound staging and just cleanliness and overall clarity. That's how good these around $200 DACs are at the moment. So quick final thoughts, D50 III is as good of a DAC as it gets at this price point. But it's not the best at that price point, and there are different flavorings that you might prefer. if you only use single-ended outputs, E32 might be a great option too. If you want balanced outputs, then D50 III is a slightly better choice. SMSL D6S is not really better, but it's just slightly different. So there you go, plenty of options. Just remember, no matter which one you decide is the best solution for you, use my links. Pretty please. And that would be all for today, guys. See you next time. Bye.